Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and my guest this week is Francis Bennett. Welcome, Francis.
Thank you, Rick.
I have a little bio here of Francis. Francis entered the Trappist Abbey of Gethsemane in 1981, and in the 90s subsequently lived at a daughter house of Gethsemane in Monk's Corner in South Carolina. Until recently, he was living in a small urban monastery in Montreal, Quebec. He has been a spiritual seeker during all those years, practicing in the Christian mystical contemplative tradition and working deeply with teachers in both the Vipassana and Zen traditions. In 2010, he experienced a profound perceptual shift in which he realized the ever-present presence of pure awareness, which some would call the presence of God. He has worked in the field of spiritual care in parish communities and with the sick and dying in hospice and hospital settings. He has led retreats, offered spiritual talks, and has accompanied many on their spiritual journey. He graduated from the Pontifical College Josephinium with a BA in philosophy and completed a 2-year chaplaincy residency with Ohio Health Hospital System. Yeah, that's your bio.
Wow, who is that guy?
So, 1980. How young were you in 1981?
22.
Huh.
Yeah, pretty young.
Yeah, and even before that, as a teenager, had you had like yearnings and leanings in this direction?
Yeah, very much so. I got involved, well, I had sort of spiritual interest and fascination with the spiritual life. As a little kid, I was always asking spiritual questions, hearing things in church, and coming home basically asking my mom about it. And usually she didn't have a lot of answers because I had some pretty strange questions.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, in my teens, early teens, I got involved in a movement that was known as the Charismatic Renewal in the
Huh.
Catholic Church and in mainline Christianity. It was a movement that was kind of a neo-Pentecostal movement with speaking in tongues and healing and lively singing and clapping and so on. And I was very intensely involved in that as a teenager and was on a quest from right at the beginning for the presence of God, sensing that to live in the presence of God was really the whole reason we were on the planet. And that kind of led me gradually to the idea of becoming a monk. And at a very young age, when I was still in high school, a high school teacher that I really loved, he was an English teacher, Keith Gochenhauer. Hi, Mr. Gochenhauer, if you're watching. And he got me turned on kind of to the writing of Thomas Merton.
Mm-hmm.
So I was reading this stuff by Thomas Merton. I was very fascinated by it. And I realized that the abbey that he was at in Kentucky, we had been at, he died in '68 when I was like 9 years old, but it was right in Kentucky. It was only 4 hours away. So I started going down there when I was still in high school. And then gradually, over a few years of going down there and going on retreats, the monks got to know me pretty well, and I got to know them. And the idea of becoming a Trappist seemed like a great thing to do. And I really wanted to somehow give my life completely to the spiritual search and to God. I get a little, sorry. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I get a little choked up sometimes. But anyway, I just wanted to dedicate my whole life to that.
That's great.
And that seemed like a way to do that. And so I did. At the age of 22, I entered, and the rest is history, as they say.
Beautiful.
So,
It seems like the Trappists must be a fairly liberal group because you're all studying Zen and Vipassana and all this stuff, and
yeah.
nobody seemed to have a problem with it.
No, actually, the whole movement, it's very interesting. You might know something about this because you were in the TM movement in the 70s and stuff. And right now, I don't know if you're aware of it, but in the Christian contemplative tradition, there's a whole movement centered around the practice of centering prayer,
All right,
which
who was the
is,
guy that started that?
well, Thomas Keating, Basil Pennington,
That's right. Yeah, so
and
they all learned TM in the 70s, early
they learned
70s.
TM at Spencer, Massachusetts,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
and they kind of adapted that, and also from our own tradition, from the Cloud of Unknowing, from the early Desert Fathers, who used also kind of mantra-type meditative techniques. They came up with this whole new approach to Christian contemplative practice, utilizing a lot of the meditational techniques that you find in TM and classical Advaita Vedanta meditations, and really all the major spiritual traditions have very much the same sort of technology
Mm-hmm.
of meditation. And in Christianity, I think in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of people turning toward the East, going to India, working with Zen masters. And in the United States, I think, since the turn of the century, really, as far as I can see, was kind of inundated with Eastern spiritual teachers of all stripes. And so I think there was a lot of concern in the church that, we had our own contemplative tradition, and yet these people were all turning away from the church and turning to the Eastern practices. And I think it was an attempt to kind of say to them, that's great, the Eastern practices have something to offer, but we also have our own approach to this, and you could profit from that. And so the whole centering movement, centering prayer movement grew up really is a kind of, I don't know, maybe a red-haired stepchild, or I don't know what you'd say, of TM.
Yeah.
TM really, I think, ushered in a lot of that. So
Yeah, I remember when those guys were doing TM, Thomas Keaton and Basil Pennington, they would come and speak at conferences and everything. Do you feel like what they did was they kind of just modified TM to make it more Christian, or did they actually look back in their own traditions and to see whether something of this nature could be found there, and actually found it and then kind of revived it to make it the centering prayer?
yeah, I think what they did was they took the techniques of the way TM, maybe the style of teaching, the way of like meditative sort of instruction, and you sit there, you close your eyes, you have a prayer word, you repeat it. When your mind starts to wander, you go back to your word. That was sort of, they were using a kind of technology, but they really did go back and rediscover the rich contemplative tradition that you find in Christianity from the early Desert Fathers who had little prayer words they would say that were really mantra-like things. And especially this one book was very influential by an unknown British English author of I believe it was the 16th century, if I'm not mistaken. It could be 14th or 16th, I'm not sure. And it's The Cloud of Unknowing. And in that book, he's really talking about the same reality. And it's basically using a meditational technique to bring you to hopefully an awakening. But I think there's definitely connection with TM. There's when you see these guys were actually turned on to this concept by their study of TM. And I think you're right that the Trappist communities in general were very ecumenical, very interfaith, very open to different spiritual traditions because we were a contemplative order. I think many of the leaders of this community, the Trappists worldwide, were very interested in just facilitating for people a living experience of God. And these things that from the East were doing that for people. And I think they were really able to hear that. And I think that speaks to their kind of openness of heart. And I think it is a pretty open-minded religious community, I would say. Yeah.
Did they get grief from more conservative aspects of the church, or are they autonomous enough that they can just do what they want without? Yeah.
They are autonomous enough that they can do what they want, and yes, they got grief. There's still people who think centering prayer is
The devil or whatever.
of the devil and things like that. And but I think by and large, even there's a lot of Protestant groups now, and there's even evangelical groups. I'm friends with some evangelical ministers of various traditions, and they're getting kind of turned on to the idea of centering prayer. Great. And asking me a lot. I've done a lot of speaking in Protestant, especially evangelical churches and circles about the contemplative Christian tradition. And they're very open. There's a lot of openness in the world, and there's a lot of closeness. And that's true in any religious milieu. It's true in non-dualist circles. It's true in Christian circles. It's true in Buddhist. I was very involved with Theravadan teachers in Vipassana for a long time. And, there's different schools of thought. In any organized religious or spiritual tradition, you get fundamentalists, you get moderates, and you get liberals. And it's just sort of the nature of the game, I think. So.
There also always seems to be a tussle between those who are kind of more experientially oriented and those who are more belief oriented, and who put more emphasis on the external trappings and appearances as opposed to the internal realization. The two don't necessarily they're not on the same wavelength always.
Not always. I mean, hopefully they feed each other and sort of engage each other in a wonderful dance that's very beautiful and creative, liturgy and and ritual and also inner realization of the truth, and they should work hand in hand. But unfortunately, a lot of times people miss the forest for the trees, so to say, and they get so focused on the forms that they forget the underlying reality that the forms are supposed to be pointing to, you know.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think that's a danger in all spiritual. It can sometimes, unfortunately, become more about a need to be right
Mm.
and a need to be sure and to have some sense of security. And I don't think that's really what it was meant to point to, but that's what a lot of times religious trappings and ritual and form and technique and practices and all that can sometimes become an end in themselves. And they're meant to be a means to an end instead.
Yeah, it's
You
an
know,
interesting point. You know, I kind of see it as the sort of rigidity of belief and attachment to form for the sake of security, as you say, as being symptomatic of a lack of inner experience, and it's a compensatory measure, you know,
yeah,
because the inner experience is deficient, and if the experience is much more rich internally, then you can just kind of relax about all that stuff, you know.
right.
It's like either you don't know anything or everything, you know, it has its own validity from its own in its own, you know, domain, and but you kind of more easygoing about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, young man, 21, 22 years old, you're kind of hanging out with these guys, and at what age did you finally join the monastery?
22.
Oh, 22. Okay,
Yeah, I officially joined at the age of 22.
great. And of course, most 22-year-olds are full of juniper juice and bilge water, as my mother used to say.
I might have been full of that too at the same time. I don't know.
You know,
You can
tending
ask
to
my old novice master what he thinks about that.
full of energy, tending to bounce off the walls and all. But did you kind of settle right into it? And
I think I'm still sort of full of energy bouncing off all of it. Especially since I had this shift. I'm like, my energy's through the roof for some reason. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean, no, I wouldn't say I settled right into it. I was a very social guy. I was very involved. I was in a Christian rock band.
oh cool. What'd you play?
I played guitar and
Oh,
sang.
I was a drummer, as you probably know.
I heard you say that, yeah. Um, so I was a pretty active guy, you know. I was
Yeah.
involved in sports. I was involved in singing. I was very, very spiritually kind of engaged with this whole charismatic thing. I was one of the leaders of a big, huge youth group.
Uh-huh.
I was the worship leader, like, of this big youth group. And when I suddenly,
In your 20s.
yeah,
Yeah.
in my teens,
Wow.
from the
Okay.
time I was about 14 until I entered the Trappist, I was
Wow.
very engaged in all that. And a lot of people were pretty shocked when when I, elected to join a contemplative order where people kept silence and shaved their heads. I had long blonde hair way down, you
Yeah.
know, I was very proud of, by the way. And so I had to shave all that off, and I keep my mouth shut and, chant psalms and all this stuff. And I think some of my friends maybe thought I was a little nuts, but
Mm.
it was
Well,
what I wanted to do. It was my passion, really. So.
that's great. Well, we're all a little nuts, but but anyway, so you got into it, and so take us through it. Whatever you feel is significant in your sojourn as a Trappist and leading up to this awakening you had.
Well, it's funny because I know you've talked a lot about this whole dynamic of, do people just suddenly awaken, or do they practice a long time and sort of gradually awaken, or and a lot of people have different stories about that. Some people say they can't really point to a date where they just sort of woke up, but they just gradually, there were little shifts here and there, and they seem to kind of incrementally go through this transformation of consciousness. And for me, it was kind of both, really. When I was a Trappist, very early on, I was still a novice, and this Korean Zen master came to the monastery, and I actually was one of the people that showed him around. He came over with some students. He had some students in Lexington, and he came over with a group of students, and he was curious to see the monastery. So I happened to be there with another couple monks, and we ended up showing him around, and I was so impressed by this man's spontaneity and just childlike, full of wonder, over just the most ordinary, normal things. And he was asking all kinds of questions. What's that like? What's it? It's like a 6-year-old, You know how you are when you're 6 and you want to know about everything. At least I was that way. I was asking my dad about the planets, about grass, about flowers, about bugs, about, everything.
Sure.
Well, this guy was like that. He was just full of wonder and joy and just, joie de vivre, as they say. And he just so impressed me. I thought, there's something just wonderful about this man. He's full of spontaneity and joy. And so he offered to come and give us Zen retreats, little Zen retreats. They usually just lasted a weekend or so. One of them, I think, lasted about a week, but mostly they were short. He'd give us koans to work on. And so early on, when I was still in my 20s, I'll never forget the first sort of what they call satori that I had. I had just been on this little retreat with Son Sin Nim. He was the founder of the, I believe it was the Providence Zen Center, a Korean Zen master. And Satsang, I think, he goes by different names, but we called him Son Sin Nim. And I began corresponding with him, and whenever he would come, I would take the retreat. And I remember after about maybe my third or fourth retreat, I was walking down the Start Cloister at Gethsemani, and all white walls, and the sun was coming in through the windows, and there were little dust particles kind of dancing in the sunlight. And there was this moment of total presence. I was just totally there. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I kind of coupled it with an experience I had very early in life of the presence of God, feeling a sense of awe and wonder and joy and peace and just tranquility of God's presence. And yet all my life it would like come and go and come and go. And I was always searching for that presence. Well, when I had that experience of being in the present moment, I suddenly had this, it was like a mini awakening, realizing, hey, being in the present moment is being in the presence of God. There's no difference. The present moment, presence of God, same thing. And I told that to Son Sin Nim. He says, yes, that's very true. Presence of God is presence of present moment. Yes. French. I've been living in French. So I might start speaking French. I just said we. No, he didn't say we. He didn't speak French.
Right.
But anyway, that was a little kind of opening. But then it was a little frustrating because like this sense of the present moment, it would just come and go. It would come. It'd be there for maybe a day or two, even after a retreat or something, or listening to him speak even, or listening to even one of the monks speak in some very inspiring way. We had this monk named Father Matthew Keldy, who was just absolutely a mystic, and he would speak sometimes, and I would feel just absolutely permeated with the presence of God. It was everywhere, and it was just wonderful, but then it would fade. And so then I would seek for it again, and I'd meditate and pray and do all these intense things. And then it would come back for a while, and then it would go, and then it would just this like hide and seek. So that went on for a long time. I mean, it went on in my Zen period. I then gotten interested in Vipassana meditation and studied with some really wonderful teachers in that lineage, and got very intense about that. I was at one point where I was doing mindfulness practices, just going on retreats where you didn't speak at all, where you just noted everything, eating, walking, sitting, thinking. You just went through your whole day like that.
You'd actually think the thought corresponding to the thing you were doing. You'd think you'd be eating, but you'd think the word eating.
Well, it was like, yeah. Mm-hmm. Just to kind of note it and to kind of it was trying to point you to just being present in the experience itself.
Right.
But a lot of times, like we talked before, people get caught up in the technique and they miss the idea that, hey, this is meant to be a means to an end. It's meant to point you beyond itself. And, you can get very sort of caught in a technique.
Right.
I would say, and also there's something I think misleading about the whole thing. And this is where I think a lot of these sort of neo-Advaitic people get down on practices because they say, well, awareness is already present. You don't have to do anything to get there. It's already here, which is true. But there are little things that can point you toward recognizing that, I think. And that's what I think practices are meant to be, pointers that point you toward that spacious awareness that's always already present. But a lot of times people get so caught in the practice itself and the doing of it, that they miss the end.
Yeah, they focus on the finger rather than the moon that the finger's pointing at.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
Yeah,
And I think I did that for a long time. For many years, I was very intensely involved, but I had little glimpses, little glimpses of the now, little glimpses of the present moment, little glimpses of the always present awareness, spacious awareness in which every single thing that exists, arises and ceases. And I'd get little glimpses of it. And so then my perception was, okay, this is something that's outside of me, and I have to do all these practices to try to get it. Or it's like a trait, like learning how to play the piano or something, and I have to practice and practice and practice till I get really good at it,
yeah,
I think that's, again, missing the forest for the trees, sort of. But I was sincerely seeking, and I guess I had to go through some years. Apparently I did, because that's what happened. So I went through some years of that type of seeking, and it was very intense. And I learned a lot. But ultimately it was a very coming and going kind of experience.
yeah. I mean, in a way, it sounds silly when we say, well, it's like you compare it to playing the piano, where you have to practice and practice until you get good at it. But I think there is a legitimate comparison, in the sense that, when you're doing something like that, or take gymnastics, which is very much in the air these days. If you've been watching the Olympics, there's a certain kind of conditioning that the nervous system undergoes, in which it, over time becomes kind of ingrained in its functioning to display a certain ability, like piano playing or gymnastic abilities or whatever. And if you didn't practice, even though potentially you have the ability, that ability isn't going to be realized. And
it's like that with guitar. I mean, I play guitar, and
sure.
You go through learning chords, learning chord progressions, learning all these different things, and then eventually it becomes second nature to you, and you just do it naturally, and you don't even have to think about it. It just kind of flows out of you.
Yeah.
And, I think maybe, yeah, that's the idea, I think, with all kind of practice.
So when you're living in presence, fully, there's something going on in the nervous system that is enabling that to you to do that, and enabling that to take place. And that, may not just turn on like a light switch. It may need to be cultured over time until it eventually becomes sort of stabilized in the functioning of the nervous system.
That's interesting. I don't think in terms like that about nervous systems and things, but
you got one.
I do, I'm sure.
You have a brain.
Yeah. I do. Well, sometimes I wonder. But I do, it's funny, because we were just talking about this whole thing of, is it sudden? Is it gradual? And like I say, for me, it was both. I mean, I went through this gradual thing, and, a sense of presence and awareness would arrive, and then it would kind of seem to go away. And it was like that for many, many, many years. And I kind of came to the conclusion after a while, well, that's just the way it is. It comes and goes. You're never stable in this. It just, sometimes you feel that sense of presence, and then sometimes you don't, and that's just the way it is. And then, like several years ago, one day, and I can put a date on it and everything, it hit me that I was in church one day. I was in church, going through a church service, and it was like I got hit by lightning or something. I mean, suddenly there was this deep sense of presence, deep sense of awareness. And unlike the other times that had arisen and kind of hit me and come into my life, I suddenly saw in a split kind of instant that awareness had always been there. That presence of God, that awareness, that consciousness, whatever name you want to put on it, it had always, always been there. It couldn't not be there. Like, it's just like, there's no way it can't be present.
Right.
Like you exist, okay? You exist, I exist. Can you not exist? Or could you somehow exist more than you do right now? Or could you exist less? You either exist or you don't, right? And that's sort of what came to me, what suddenly became absolutely clear to me was that this awareness, this consciousness, is eternally present. Always has been, always will be. Mm-hmm. And once I saw that so clearly, it's never left since. It's just there. It's just always there. Yeah, well, it's not much you can say about that.
Yeah.
It's hard to
Now,
talk about.
no, you're doing well. Um, and of course, it has always been there, but it hadn't always been there in your experience.
No,
But now it is, and it wasn't always there at all in the experience of the other people in that church service. And yet it was right there on some level for them, but it wasn't realized. And now
right.
what many teachers will do these days, and I consider it a rather unskillful means of teaching, is get up and just sort of describe what you just described and expect people to get it on the basis of that description. And maybe sometimes some do, maybe if they're ripe, or at least they get some kind of intellectual familiarity with it. But it's not the substitute for the so-called real thing.
No, I can tell you that by experience. It's the real thing is so amazing.
Yeah.
You can't describe it, and you can't conceptualize it. Even these words I'm saying, hopefully they're pointing to it in a certain sense, but it's a very poor pointer. You have to realize it. It has to be a living reality in your
Yeah.
life. And I think that's what all spirituality and religion is proposing to be about. Unfortunately, it's not always what it is about, but that's certainly, I think, what it's meant to be about.
Well, my favorite little phrase that I always say, don't mistake understanding for realization. So, it would be people would be selling themselves short if they accepted or settled for an understanding of what you've just been describing for the real living experience of it. It would be a tragedy.
It's like reading a beautiful poem about oranges
Yeah,
and biting into an orange.
right.
It's the different, it's a totally different thing we're talking about.
Yeah,
Not that a beautiful poem about biting into an orange wouldn't be wonderful, that's great, but has its
far.
limitations,
It's a
doesn't it?
far cry from the experience of the
Far
orange.
cry if you've ever bitten into a really good, great, sweet orange,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So,
Yeah, so this point bears dwelling upon, I think, that what all this spiritual stuff is about is a living experience. In case anybody doesn't get that, I think most people do, but maybe not everyone does. It's a living experience. It's not an intellectual facility with the concept of it or an intuitive sense that it's there or anything else. It's living 24/7.
well, yeah, I think so. And even the reality of this that we're talking about now, I think the only way to teach this, I often say it's caught, not taught.
It's
It's
caught
caught, not taught, like a
like
cold.
a flu or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a negative.
Yeah.
Yeah, caught, not taught. That you can say all the right words.
Hmm.
You can have you can have an amazing intellectual grasp of non-duality, for example, and be eloquent and be able to just talk about it for hours on end and maybe keep people spellbound on a certain sort of intellectual level.
Hmm.
But if you don't have that realization in your life, if you don't have a kind of direct scene of that, people might catch a kind of intellectual curiosity and stimulation, but I think the thing itself is somehow intuited or picked up. And the reason we pick it up from others is because it's already who we are. We're already that. We're totally already that, all of us. And when we see that in someone else, it's almost like looking into a mirror. You just, when I look at a picture, for example, of Ramana Maharshi, I just dissolve. It's so beautiful just to look into his eyes, and it's just a photo,
Yeah.
but it's like there's something in you. In fact, it's this awareness, it's this consciousness in me that recognizes the consciousness that was in him.
Hmm.
And I think that's
That's what the phrase namaste means.
yeah, like kind of saying, okay, I bow to like the Christ in you, the sacred divinity in you, and it's also in me. It's in everyone. It's in everything. It's in every single form. It's that formlessness going into form. Now there's something coming up there on the screen. I'm a little afraid
I think we're okay.
everything's okay. Okay.
Everything's groovy. Well, this caught, taught, not taught thing is a good one because, well, traditionally, and probably every tradition, including yours, it was known that sort of being in the company of the enlightened, so to speak, would, get would infuse you with that. It's just like if you hang around a lot of people who have the flu, chances are you're going to get it.
Right, right.
And that's what satsang is all about, being in the company, of truth. And there's this word transmission. I don't know what in the Vedic terminology that would be called darshan, where there's an actual sort of resonance that takes place between, the teacher and the students, or even among the whole group, which gets everyone sort of attuned to a higher level of awareness. And Ramana, his main teaching, I mean, people always say, oh yeah, self-inquiry, but really his main teaching was just sort of basking in his silence,
Right.
if you were so fortunate as to be in his presence, and becoming so attuned in that way to that level of awareness.
Well, like the little book I wrote, I have a chapter at the end of there called "The Purest Teaching is Silence."
Mm-hmm.
And really, one day one morning I was on a retreat and I wrote that chapter just sitting at a little table in my room. And I had had a particularly deep experience of silence that morning, of just sort of basking in that. And that, in fact, that if I had to describe, like, if I do practice now, I wouldn't call it practice. Really, it doesn't seem like practice. But usually for several hours every morning, I just sit in this silence and I just sort of am completely absorbed in that for several hours usually. I mean, I don't keep track of it, but it seems
Right.
to be about that amount of time normally. And
Just marinate.
marinate, yeah. Well, for 4 months after this happened, I could barely speak, and I pretty much marinated all the time. I would,
Really?
yeah. It was very intense. After this happened,
Let's backtrack a little bit. I mean, we kind of glossed over it, but say, what more can you say about the actual awakening that you had in that church?
mhm.
Can you say more than you said?
Well, yeah, it was just suddenly, I was actually at Mass. I was at Mass.
Were you officiating or just participating?
No, I was just participating. I'm not a priest. I was a brother, so I
Okay.
was an ordained priest.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to Mass every day in the community. So I was there at Mass. The priest held up the host, the little
Wafer.
red wafer. He said, Corps de Christ. It was in French. He said, Body of Christ. He stuck it in my hand, and I looked down at this little wafer in my hand, and I thought, it wasn't even I thought, it was like a flash. A flash came to me. He's putting this in our hands, and we're looking at it, and we're thinking that we know what this is. And suddenly it occurred to me, I don't know what this is. Put the
And
wafer in my hand, I looked down at it, and suddenly it was like, I would say it was like I had no language. I had no thoughts, like the mind just stopped. There were no thoughts. I just looked at this in wonder, and I had no idea what it was. And suddenly, I just like, what is this? It wasn't even words. It was just like, what is everything? It was like my conceptual sort of abilities just stopped. and even my sense of myself, of God, everything just sort of, it was gone. It was clean gone. And for a while, for probably about a week after that, I thought maybe I was losing my mind. I wasn't sure. It really was very destabilizing at first. I didn't know what to think. And then I was on a search, like I was looking at mystics. I was reading all these. I was pretty familiar with the works of like John of the Cross and people like that. And I was then on a search to try to comprehend what had happened to me. Although I was filled with bliss, there was a deep bliss there. But there was like hardly any thinking going on. The thinking faculty just turned off, like just completely turned off. And yet the funny thing about that is I could function so well. I wasn't like thinking about things at all, but I was just functioning. I was doing things. I was writing talks. I was giving talks. I was ministering to people. I was visiting the dying and elderly and stuff, and words were coming out of my mouth, and in fact, people seemed to be more touched by what I said or what I did or just my simple presence, and it was a whole different experience of living, really.
But your subjective experience at that time, I mean, everyone saw you as being like really together and you're functioning well and you're inspiring them, but your subjective experience was that you were kind of on autopilot and you didn't know what was going on, and you
No,
thought
really, I wouldn't. Autopilot sounds kind of like a zombie that's kind of going to. It was more like I was just in bliss. I
yeah,
was
yeah,
just
just
in like the
just
most
bathing in that.
incredible. Uh, I st I'm sorry.
That's okay. No apologies.
Um, Sometimes it just hits me.
Yeah.
Uh, you can edit this stuff, right?
No, no, people love this stuff.
To see some guy blubbering on the screen. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, it was just like I was just swimming in this bliss, but there was still all this functioning going on.
Hmm.
And sometimes sometimes that thought would arise like, how is this possible? Like, how am I doing all this high functioning stuff and I'm not giving it a moment's thought? It's just kind of happening through me. And my sense really was there's a little scripture in St. Paul where he says, it is now not I who live, but Christ lives in me.
Hmm.
And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. And it was like that. It was like the Christ or consciousness or what you could call it a lot of different things. But this reality was just, this blissful reality was just functioning through this body and mind. And I was just kind of watching it happen. And it's still, it just hasn't gone away. I think I've adjusted to it a little. It's not so strange now. It's more like just normal. But for 4 months, I really went through a little bit of an adjustment, kind of a learning curve. I don't know what you call it. And I called my Vipassana teacher friend a lot, Eric Kolvig. He's a wonderful friend and teacher. And I called him a lot. He kind of, I was like, what's going on with me? And he was saying, no, I think this is good. This is a good thing. You're definitely coming into all this stuff we've been talking about and trying to practice for all these years. And so, but it was a big shift. Shift is a good word for it.
Mm. Shift happens, as they say. It's a bumper sticker. Well, yeah, I was going to say, because you were referring to it in the past tense, it was this and it was that, but then of course you went on and added that it wasn't just past, it's now, but you have integrated or adjusted to it, which I think is an important point.
At first, it was just so different. I mean, my whole sense of being was totally turned upside down. And I don't know, I think it would be kind of normal for most people to have a little bit of an adjustment period where it really, I didn't, even though it was wonderful, filled with bliss, filled with joy, filled with peace. But I mean, on a kind of conceptual or intellectual level, I had no idea what had happened to me. I knew that I was somehow experiencing this deep sense of union with God, what I would call God, but it was a mystery, and I couldn't talk about it. I mean, I went to my spiritual director. I kind of stammered out this thing happened to me, and he sort of asked me a few questions, and I tried to answer them, but I couldn't. And a lot of times when I would try, I would just what happened to me just now. I would just get hit. I'd get a hit of this stuff. This bliss would just sort of overwhelm me, and I'd dissolve. I couldn't even speak.
Uh-huh.
And that went on for, I would say, 4 months, a good 4 months. It was really funny, kind of interesting.
There's an interesting thing here. I have this friend who watches all the interviews and everything and has declined to be interviewed because she feels like there's really no one there to a sufficient degree that she could actually conduct and be interviewed, and so we have this kind of debate about, is there a point at which you'd have to, you could be so far gone that you couldn't hold down a job on the New York Stock Exchange or any kind of practical thing. You wouldn't want to be flying an airplane, with a couple hundred people in it. Or is it possible to integrate any degree of realization with practical life? And there are kind of examples and arguments on both sides of it. There are these Indian saints like Neem Karoli Baba and Ananda Ma, who pretty much had to be fed and kept from wandering off into the forest. You couldn't imagine, or even Ramana Maharshi, you couldn't imagine him sort of working as a railroad conductor or something really down to earth. Or is that just that it's not their dharma and they're just serving the function for which they were designed, and perhaps there could be a fully realized to the same degree person living in very practical circumstances. It's an open question. I'm not sort of coming down on it one way or the other.
I think that it's certainly, for me anyway, I can only speak from my own experience. I don't really know a lot about other people's experience with all this stuff, but I think for me, it was a matter of just a kind of adjustment. When it first happened, it blew my mind. I mean, it literally blew my mind, and I didn't really know what had happened. And yet, the ironic thing, like I said, I was functioning very well, even better than usual, I would say, and yet there was no concern about the function. It was just function was happening through me, through this body.
Automatically. Automatically.
Automatically, kind of.
Yeah.
And I was just sort of watching it happen. And sometimes I was sometimes I would go, wow, that went well, for not having put any thought into it. I would get up and give talks just extemporaneously. It would just come through me, and people would be crying and people would be really moved. And I would think, wow, that's really different. Before I would prepare talks and, take a normal amount of kind of preparation. And I just wasn't able to do that at that point. Although gradually I sort of readjusted, and, this really hits on a point that you and I have talked about. I know that I think is very important, is this idea of the absolute and relative. On an absolute level, we are just this pure consciousness and this awareness and this bliss, and yet there is a reality on a relative level. I am Francis, and I have certain, responsibilities, you could say. I have certain roles I play in life, and more and more, for me, there's a deeper and deeper and deeper integration of these two levels. And more, it's just like there's no problem with either one of these levels. They're both absolutely valid. And while I'm moving through the relative world of roles and things, like I could be an uncle, a friend, I could play different roles. I could be a spiritual advisor to somebody or something. It's a role I play. It's not who I am on any absolute level, but it's got its place. It's got its sort of function. And for me, there's just no problem between those two. Like to say that, I mean, I don't know what your friend's going through with, maybe she's going through a developmental sort of phase of integration of some.
She seems to feel that she's really done, and she's one of these people, and I've interviewed a number of them who, when you talk about, okay, well, where does it go from here? What's your sense of further progress? And they kind of scratch their heads and say, well, I'm done. How could there be progress? It's finished.
See, I mean, on an absolute level, that's true. I think on a relative level, it's never finished.
Yeah, that's the way I see it, but I can't, when people say that, the best I can do is say, well, let's see what happens. Let's see where you are in 10 years. But it seems to me there's never any end to growth. And there may not be growth of the absolute. How can that grow? It can't grow. But in terms of integration, the word you just used, is there any end to that? Is there?
I don't think so.
And let's define integration. Well, you define integration.
I think integration is the interfacing of two things that seemingly are different. And then I think the integration process is the kind of gradual realization that they're not different. They're just two sides of the same coin. They're not at all opposed to one another in any way, shape, or form. It's like that old thing from that Mahayana Sutra that says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is none other than emptiness, emptiness is none other than form. The Heart Sutra, I think it's called. They used to chant it in the Zen practice I did. And I think what that's saying is that these levels are absolutely one. I mean, the whole idea of non-duality is not two. It's non-dual. It's everything's one. well, then the relative and absolute can't be absolutely opposed to one another. What is that?
It's
Duality.
duality, right?
So,
It's not Advaita.
well, so my sense is that the growing sort of, and this is one area of growth, is where you gradually come to a sense that there's absolutely no contradiction between these two things whatsoever, none at
Yeah.
all. It's like there was a book by Ken Wilber, and can't remember the name of it. I read a couple books by him, but he had this one where he had a lens, and it was a concave lens, but it was like saying, well, it's convex and concave at the same time.
Right.
Any convex lens is also a concave lens. Just flip it over. It's a concave. Then it's convex. Then it's concave. Is there, is convex and concave opposed to one another? No.
Yeah.
See that it's the same. It's just an analogy or a metaphor, but I think it's the same with the relative and the absolute. There's just absolutely no. The relative is absolute, and the absolute's relative in a certain sense. The absolute is relative in the sense that the relative is a manifestation of the absolute. And we couldn't have any kind of appreciation for the absolute unless there was a relative to, you see what I'm saying? I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very paradoxical kind of language.
Kind of gets us back to why the creation exists in the first place. You know.
Who knows? I'm not sure about that one.
Well, but think about it. If there weren't a creation, then could the absolute really appreciate itself?
Right. Right.
You know?
I mean, like, say, just look at the concept of space. If you had infinite space with no objects appearing in it, then you couldn't really understand or have any kind of graph of space without the objects. If there was just space, well, there'd be nothing in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's just one little object in the space, then you could suddenly become very conscious of the space somehow.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that it limps, all analogies limp, as they say, but it sort of points to this idea that, the relative can't exist without the absolute. And in a certain sense, the absolute can't exist or stand out or be perceptible without the relative. So is emptiness, emptiness is form.
This gets back to sort of the Andrew Cohen theme of evolutionary enlightenment, a 14 billion year process in which these sophisticated instruments have evolved to the point where where the absolute can realize itself as a living reality, I want to just dwell on the concept of integration just for another moment, because it may seem that word has a connotation of just overcoming a handicap that sort of afflicts one when realization takes place, in which you no longer can function properly and you have to get integrated in order to carry on an ordinary life. But I think it goes way beyond that, to degrees to which divinity or the light of God can be radiated through the form of an enlightened person, and that can become very, very, very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that's what it wants to do, doesn't it? I don't know why. It's kind of interesting, but it seems like it kind of enjoys this, all these forms, all these plants and trees and animals and insects, and it's amazing. I mean, anymore I just look around and see all these things, and sometimes I'm just blown away by the beauty and the wonder of it all. It's just so, it's amazing. And yet that seems to be what the absolute wants, for lack of a better, wants to do. It loves to play like that. It's just, it's odd, isn't it? It's strange. Yeah.
One thing that you and I talked about outside of this interview was your experience of being aware during sleep. And I was thinking about that, and maybe you could talk about it a little bit, and then I'll give you a few quotes from people that I kind of came up with after we had that conversation.
Oh, that would be interesting for me, because I've asked a few people that I run across that have had little sort of awakenings or claiming to have big awakenings or whatever, and I haven't really run across too much about it, but it's just since this happened to me, my experience of sleep and dream and waking, of course, we've already talked about the difference in the waking experience a little, but especially dream and sleep have really changed a lot. This awareness, like under kind of coming to a discovery of the fact in a certain way that this spacious awareness and consciousness is just always present. It can't not be present. It's just there, and it's just there when I sleep too. It's really interesting, and it's hard to put into words exactly because it's like when you're asleep, there's no objects, like there's no body, there's no world, there's no, but there's still that awareness is still fully there, and yet there's nothing for it to be aware of but itself, if that makes sense. I don't know. And it's like you're not really, when I wake up, there's a sense that that's what's been going on. This awareness has just been there. But when I'm actually in the sleep, it's totally empty. It's just awareness. And since there's no objects, I don't know. It's really hard to put into words.
You're saying it pretty well. I mean, really? the faculty which would say to itself, "Oh, cool, I'm having this inner awareness while I'm sleeping," that's shut off. You're asleep. Totally that's a waking state function, and the waking state isn't there.
Well, that doesn't even exist very much in the waking state now, but it doesn't exist at all in deep sleep. Yeah. So it's a whole different. Well, it's not, in one way. It's not different. It's the exact same. It's the exact same experience. It's not an experience, but it's the exact same. Words always just totally break down about this time. That's what's always there. That awareness is what's always there. It's who I am really on an absolute level. And I don't stop being who I am when I'm asleep. I guess that's a simple way to put it. Yeah. It's still there. It's still present.
The quotes I thought of were, well, there's that verse from the Song of Solomon in the Bible. I sleep. I sleep though my heart waketh.
I love that. That really, I think, really says it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there was a thing from Ramana Maharshi that somebody sent me. I meant to print it out and I forgot to. But basically, he was referring to the same experience. And I don't know, maybe I'll post it on your page on Batgap, the exact quote. But it was, very clear that's what he was talking about. Huh. And then there was this great yogi who lived in the caves outside Rishikesh named Tatwala Baba. And one time somebody asked him, "Do you sleep?" And he said, "What would happen to the world if I slept?" And then they said, "You should come to London." And he said, "I am London."
A little non-dual stand-up comedy there.
Yeah.
I don't really. The other thing too that's interesting is I don't sleep much at all anymore. Yeah. It's kind of strange. I don't seem to need
as many hours.
No, but I'm like full of energy all the time. It's certainly my energy since this thing has happened is much greater, much more vital, and just I just never seem to lose energy. But I don't need very much sleep. I go to bed late now, and I wake up really early. And then even when I'm asleep, it's restful. The body's resting, but there's still consciousness is still fully there. But it's strange. I don't know. I'm not trying to make some big deal about it or anything, but it was just, I think I asked you because you're so knowledgeable about these things, and I'm really not. I have my experience, but and I've read, I read a lot of stuff of Ramana Maharshi. And he didn't write a lot, but I read everything he wrote. And he's made, in talks by Ramana Maharshi, I ran across little kind of snippets of reference to this, but I never really heard much about it. And then when I mentioned it to you, you said, "Oh no, you seem to know about it." So I was curious.
Well, the reason I do is that in the TM movement, which was my background, Maharshi made a big deal of that, and he said it's really the acid test of self-realization. If you lose awareness during sleep, you're not self-realized. You may think you are. It might seem to be there in the waking state, but if you're out like a light with no inner awareness during sleep, then it's not fully established. And of course, he didn't consider that to be a final state. There's some kind of cool stuff way beyond that, but that was the kind of the. Huh. Like I say.
I don't know though, because I've heard a few people on your site that you interviewed, and you asked that question a couple times, I remember, and they no, that wasn't that they weren't conscious during sleep. And they seemed pretty awake to me. Like what they said really resonated with me, and I felt a sense that they're seeing this. Because there's something about this when this happens to you, and even saying it happens to you isn't accurate at all, but anyway, for the sake of conversation, when this happens to you, you recognize it in other people. Like it's hard to explain, but just when you see somebody, even just see them, they don't even have to open their mouth. But especially when they open their mouth and they start talking about it, you get that, okay, they really see this too. There's like a sense of, I don't know how to explain it. It's almost like recognizing somebody in your family. Like maybe you had a brother that you never knew about, and you see him and you go, oh, wow, he looks like me. He's somehow must be a brother or something. You just sort of know it. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's funny.
Yeah. Well, in my fundamentalist TM days, I would have said, yes, it's absolutely a necessity. You have to have awareness during sleep. Now it's like, who knows? And
I don't know many things.
Right.
I don't know nothing, in fact.
Yeah. And I actually have friends. We used to have this weekly satsang. It's still going on here in town. I used to go to it every week before I started doing Batgap. But I remember one evening, I just kind of like really dwelt on that point, made the whole evening about it, and I just kept asking all these guys, and I said, like, if I gave you $1 million, it's like, and most of them said, it was, for me, it was a phase, and I'd rather be out like a light, I'd just rather be asleep. Now,
well, maybe that'll happen with me. I don't know.
Maybe it will. Who knows?
This has only been, it's going on 3 years now, so.
But that friend of ours whom we spoke with, that I referred you to, who wishes to remain anonymous.
Yeah.
He said he hasn't lost awareness since he was like 10 years old.
Yeah,
he's in his mid-60s.
He was great for me to talk to because he confirmed a lot of the strange sort of aspects of this in my experience, and he was like, "Oh no, that's perfectly fine." He was like real matter of fact. Oh no, that's normal. Because I was full of questions. I really have been in an environment where I really didn't have much opportunity to talk to anybody who had this kind of thing happen to them. And I was always searching for that. I was like, if a spiritual director or somebody like that would come through town, if I got a chance to talk to them, I'd kind of ask them little, do you have any kind of funny experiences when you sleep? They kind of look at me like, what? And nobody knew what I was talking about, but anyway, I was looking for somebody in my own tradition who I felt sort of understood me, and I didn't really find it, to be honest. But
well, I think if you were able to get in a time machine and go talk to
Meister Eckhart, maybe.
Yeah, him or Teresa of Avila, one of these people, you'd find a lot of answers, a lot of.
Yeah,
they would know a lot about this. I haven't read much Christian mysticism myself, so I don't know, but I'm sure it's there.
I've been reading Christian mysticism since I was like 16 years old, so, and it's definitely there. It's definitely there, but you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit. It's also filled, a lot of Christian mystics were very, very immersed in doctrinal stuff and all that, and theological kind of understanding of things, and it's couched in a certain kind of system, religious system. But the thing that's fascinating to me is when I read these other traditions, what we're talking about is in every major religious tradition in the world. It's this non-duality, this sense of oneness with the sacred, with the divine, with God, is at the heart of every religion. And it's just talked about in different terminology, different personalities kind of expressing it, but in essence, it's the same reality, isn't it? It's interesting.
Yeah, and it's also translated through different translators from other languages, and who knows what the translators are doing to it.
Oh, yeah. I think that a lot when I read the Bible now.
Yeah.
Like, I read words of Jesus, and I think, I don't think so.
Yeah, firstly, nothing was written down for a couple hundred years, and then and then you got some guy translating from the Aramaic and maybe into the Hebrew and into the Greek, and even if they go straight from the Aramaic, there's a lot dependent upon the level of consciousness or clarity of the translator.
Right, and then you got monks kind of copying it down century after century, and maybe somebody told a joke and you got distracted and copied it down. I mean, who knows? I don't know. But, all those things also take on a lot less, like the idea of sacred scripture and it's, inspired. And it's like, I believe it's inspired, but I believe the Bhagavad Gita is inspired too. And I believe the accounts of St. Francis, the little flowers of St. Francis, are inspired. They're all, though, written through human instruments. And so they're
Right.
not going to be somehow perfect. They're going to have, all these little things we're talking about. And yet there's something that's conveyed in them. Again, they're just pointers. All this stuff, it just points. It points to this absolute reality that can't even be talked about.
Mm.
This interview itself is proof that it can't be talked about because I'm blah, blah, blah. I don't know how to talk about it. I do the best I can. And in a certain sense, I somehow feel that this consciousness wants me to talk about it. It seems that I find myself talking about it and people seem to find it helpful. But like a lot of times, even as I'm saying something, I'm feeling like, well, that's not really accurate. I mean, like the words I'm using are very poorly pointing, but they're not, it's not, and the conclusion I've come to is there's no words that exist that are adequate. They just don't
Yeah.
exist
For anything, as
for
I often,
anything.
as I often bring up, I mean, try to use words to describe the color red, you just fall flat. You can't do it.
Yeah.
Or the smell of a rose. And, there's just the realm of experience. The realm of words is a pretty poor substitute for the realm of experience. It's just sort of,
Beautiful. I love words. I
yeah,
love to write. I write poetry. I love to write. I just love it. But it's limited, It's very limited. But it can point. It can point, and it helps people in some ways. But it's inadequate, totally.
when you had your awakening, if you are okay with referring to it that way, did you pretty
I
much
prefer to it some way, I guess.
yeah. Did you more or less immediately not only realize that I am that presence or presence of God or whatever, but that all of this is that as well? All of this is, or was that a phase that came later on?
No, it all came at once.
Uh-huh.
It was totally clear that this awareness, this consciousness that I am, absolutely pervades every form that exists, as we call it, exists. That all of these things, um, for lack of a better term, they flow out of this absolute reality. They flow out of that. They're like manifestations of it. I don't know. Does that make sense? I'm
Yeah.
not.
So
Okay.
you never really went through a witnessing phase where, consciousness was seen as distinct from or separate from the relative, absolute and relative didn't get separated out. It was,
No, I went through that a lot earlier, but and it wasn't always present, but the witness was present in a lot of the time. I was the witness. That was sort of over the years that seemed to be a kind of shift that was more or less permanent, but it wasn't really totally permanent. But when this happened, that fell away with everything else. The witness fell away as much as my concept of God or, everything fell away.
mm,
Because the witness thing, I mean, a lot of therapies and stuff use that idea too of the witness and all that, witnessing consciousness and so on. But that's not the final, I mean, that's not the spacious awareness that it arises and ceases in the spacious awareness like everything else.
mm-hmm.
The witness, it seems like sometimes I hear different teachers talk about the witness as if it's some kind of like end. It's like that's it, that witness. And my sense is no, that's not quite it. That it's a phase. It's certainly a kind of a development along the path, but I don't think it's the final destination. Not
Right.
really.
Right.
That's my sense of it anyway.
Yeah. No, I would agree. Um, there's a chapter in your book about the search for happiness, and when you read that chapter, it seems so obvious that it's almost a cliche to say that happiness is really within us. It's not really a function of what's going on outside, and
Yeah.
yet it's not obvious to the
It
vast
doesn't
majority.
seem to be when you look around, does it?
No, and
Yeah.
even an awakened person. I mean, Saint John of the Cross, for instance, was confined in a little tiny room for 14 years. He couldn't lie
Toledo.
down. He couldn't stand up.
Right.
His food was thrown in among his feces. I mean, he was in a very dire circumstance. And, I wonder to what extent his inner happiness was able to sustain him under those circumstances. Because, some situations seem to challenge it. and others to, to contrast the situation like that with taking a nice hike in the mountains in fresh air.
Yeah.
And it seems like you're going to be a lot happier. But in your own experience, is there something that's just rock solid regardless of the vicissitudes of life?
Well, I mean, again, there's a relative answer to that, and there's an absolute answer to that. I mean, the relative answer is, yeah, I would be relatively more happy hiking in the Sierras than I would in a prison cell in Toledo eating gruel,
Right.
But the deepest, most absolute happiness is unconditional. It's like it's innate in this absolute reality we're talking about. This happiness is what that is. It is happiness itself. It is stability. It is happiness. It is peace. It is joy. It's all these things we think we're looking for in all these objects and situations and so on. And yeah, I mean, there is a relative truth to, yeah, I would prefer if you gave me a choice, you said, okay, you can be hiking with Rick in the Sierras and have a picnic lunch in the middle of the day and bird watch, or you can be in a prison cell. Right. Well, I would probably choose the hike,
Yeah.
But if I'm plugged into this source of absolute unconditional happiness, it's there. It's just like that awareness when you sleep, It's there. It's always there. It doesn't leave. I mean, and I don't mean to trivialize other people's pain or other people's suffering, because I have led a relatively comfortable life. It's easy for me to philosophize from my ivory tower of comfort and first world sort of security and all this. And if I were starving and living in a drain tile, maybe I'd look at it differently. I don't know. But so far anyway, my sense is that true happiness, the deepest, most, the absolute happiness, really doesn't have anything to do with our circumstances or, Does that make sense? I mean, both are true. There's a relative reality here that I think we have to honor and we have to be real about. And there's an absolute truth. And, that's just the way reality is, isn't it? It's just, it's both and. It's not either or. It's both and. Always. Yeah.
No, it is. It's so good. I wanted to elicit that from you. When you sit in the morning for several hours in silence, is it really like complete absorption, or do you have like, oh, I want to think of what have this for lunch, and oh yeah, I should have called that guy yesterday, and the little thoughts like that come up, or is it complete like immersion in the absolute?
No, it's pretty immersed. It's like sinking into something. I don't know how to explain it or describe it. It's like in a way, it's always here. That peace, that tranquility, that silence is just, it can't not be here. It's here right now. It's always here right now. And that's just the way it is.
But when in the morning, when you do that, it's there exclusively.
Well, then I close my eyes and it's there exclusively. Like
Right.
when there's no objects present anymore. And when you just close your eyes, what's there? It's just that awareness. That's what's there.
Yeah, but the average person who just closes their eyes, their mind's still buzzing along,
Yeah, well, I mean, something happened. Well, I even have that one point in the one chapter about that there is no mind, and that's what's come to me is that the idea of a mind, when we talk about mind, and I even use the word mind, it's a relative, there's a mind. But on an absolute level, there is no entity called the mind. There's functioning, there's the thinking function. And
well,
that's
on an absolute level, there's nothing.
No.
Totally absolute level, there's no body either. But on a
Right.
relative level, don't we have these faculties?
Well, yeah, but my experience anymore is that there's a thinking function. There's a thinking function that still functions fine. In fact, it functions even better now.
Just as there's a seeing function and a hearing function.
Yeah, there's a seeing function, but there's not an entity there. There's thinking, just like, I don't know, what's a good example? I like analogies and metaphors and examples. I think it's really useful because all this stuff is so impossible to talk about that if you just have a little metaphor, somebody might get a little, oh yeah, I see.
Right.
They get a little glimpse, but I can't, I'll have to see if someone.
Something will come to you.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, my experience is that there's no entity called a mind. And I ran across this in like Ramana, in the Sargadatta, and a few people I read that, the mind is dead and all this in the Yanni, the mind is dead and all this. And at first you hear that, I read that to a few people and they're like, oh, that sounds horrible. The mind is dead. And yeah, but the mind never exists. I think what they're saying is it's like the snake and the rope thing. It's like, okay, if you got a snake, if you go into your garage, I have this in the book, and it's a classical Advaita like analogy. I certainly didn't make it up. I borrowed it from Ramana, but and he borrowed it.
Yeah, he borrowed it. It goes back thousands of years.
Yeah, I think so. And it's just the idea that, and I kind of try to make it contemporary. So you go in your garage and you see this coiled up snake at the corner, and you think, oh gosh, there's a big snake there. And then you jump back and you hit the light that's on the wall, and you turn on the light and you realize, oh, it's a rope. It's a rope I coiled up and put in the corner last September, and there it is. And okay, so when you realize that the snake is not in the rope, that it's just a rope, well, did you kill the snake? Is the snake dead? Well, it's like, well, yeah, figuratively speaking, the snake is dead, but it's dead because it never was alive to begin with.
Right.
And I think that's what happens, like the ego death and the death of the mind and all this stuff that these really respected Yanni realized teachers from India and so on, they talk about. And I think what they're really saying is you suddenly realize it never was to begin with. It's not that it was really real and then it died. It's the realization that it wasn't an entity to begin with.
Incidentally, you have brought the blessings of, I don't know what, Jesus or something on Fairfield, Iowa, because it's raining outside right now for the first time in I don't know how long. We've had this
good.
severe
Wonderful.
drought. There's always these stories in the Vedas about how some country is experiencing a severe drought, and they implore some saint to come and visit them because they know that when he comes, then it's going to rain. So hey. Thanks.
I'm not saying I'm some kind of saint, but I really would like to visit Fairfield, Iowa.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah.
I find it fascinating I think it's fascinating, Fairfield, Iowa, and I'd love to come and see what's going on there and
yeah, I hope you do.
maybe move there. I don't have anything keeping me here, that's for sure.
Oh, that'd be great. But aren't you going to do some kind of prison ministry thing or something?
Well, I had several possibilities of doing some chaplaincy jobs, and they've fallen through, so I don't have a job yet. So,
okay.
And I'm willing to go wherever I can to get a job, really.
Yeah.
That's my background and my formation and education, and so on. So, and I love that work. I love that kind of ministry.
Cool. I didn't want to get you off the track. I wanted to ask the question, since you're talking about the rope and the snake and the mind never having existed really. Would you say that for all faculties, or is there something about the mind and the ego which is more illusory than, say, the senses? The sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. Aren't the mind and ego just kind of relative faculties that are necessary for our overall functioning, or is there really something less real about those than other faculties?
No, I mean, I think they exist in the sense of it's a functioning. It's a kind of human functioning.
It's a
but
mechanism
I think where we go wrong as human beings is we conceptually make it into an entity.
Yeah.
That's the basic human dysfunction, in my opinion. It's this conceptualization of reality. And then we believe that the concepts we have about something are the reality. And we miss the bus, we just don't get that, yeah, there's functioning here. There's seeing here, for example. There's tasting here, but there's no taster. There's no seer, really. That's where I think that idea of subject and object, there's no seer and there's no seeing. There's just seeing.
Yeah.
And that's really saying the seer and the seen are one. They're not two different things. All there is just the reality of seeing. Does that make sense? But there's no subject.
There's no little guy in there that is doing the seeing.
It's funny though. I think we think that. I mean, I think the sort of unenlightened human consciousness is we make up all these entities. We make up all these conceptual things, and then we believe they're real. It's kind of like there's this story that Jack Kornfield, the Vipassana teacher, tells, where he says his daughter drew this picture of a monster when she was like 6 or 7 or something, and then she put it on her wall in her room, and she said, "Daddy, I'm scared." And he said, "Why are you scared, honey?" And she said, "I'm scared of the monster." And he said, "What monster are you scared of?" And she said, that monster. And he said, honey, you drew that monster.
That's a
And
great story.
we laugh at that, but we do that.
Yeah.
We make these things up. Or, another person's good at this is the Byron Katie work,
Mm-hmm.
where we make up these stories and we scare ourselves. We have these concepts and we take them to be real. And they're not real at all. They're just concepts.
Well, I
They're
guess
real as concepts, but
that begs the question of who's making up the story.
I'm not sure. They just sort of come, don't they, these stories?
Yeah.
They come a lot less these days for me, but I'm still capable of having a story come. But I kind of right away I see it's a story. It's like, oh, that's a good one.
Well,
It's kinda
I
like,
mean, if ultimately we are not the author of our actions, and if there's some divine intelligence which is orchestrating this whole thing,
yeah,
then maybe that's the one who's made up the stories. Who
absolutely, it has to
he's
be.
made this whole universe, entered into it, plays the game, and plays hide and seek with himself.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's true. That's absolutely accurate in my experience, or at least my sense of things, I'd say. Yeah.
And for what purpose?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Expansion of happiness, maybe?
I'm not sure. I don't know what the purpose is.
I mean,
It's,
you talk about happiness and bliss and, and all that in your experience. Could that have ever been there if if one hadn't gone through this whole hide and seek game and come to an embodied realization?
yeah, yeah. Well, it's like that little analogy I have at the beginning of the fish looking for the ocean,
Right, right.
I mean, the fish finally finds the ocean because he realizes, well, the ocean's all around me and in me and I am the ocean. And he suddenly realizes that. But maybe he had to look everywhere to find it before he could realize that, It's all good, as the kids say, I don't judge it anymore. Like I see people on a frantic search and they're going through their life and they're looking for happiness. And I think, well, that's perfect for them. Maybe they need to do that for a time, maybe several lifetimes. I don't know. Who knows?
Maybe 1,000 of them.
Yeah.
It seems like an innate tendency or an innate, it's the way we're wired.
Oh, I think it is.
You know?
I think because we are happiness. We are happiness. That's who we are. And we sort of realize that. We realize it before we realize it, really. We never don't realize that on one level. And so that's why people are always looking for happiness, because they got to have happiness. It's just hardwired into the consciousness that, of course, you have to have happiness. You are happiness. They're looking in all these different places for it, and they're thinking they're going to find it in an object, and they won't, but not ultimately anyway.
Yeah, you had that great quote from Marilyn Monroe in your book. Once you get what you want, you don't want it.
Yeah, I love that. I heard it was funny because I was in the monastery and I was a novice actually. And this guy, this really famous expert on St. Bernard, and he was expert on patristics and so on. He's from Australia. And he was giving us a talk and he said, I have a quote from a very obscure saint that most people don't appreciate. And this quote is extremely wise. And he says, the quote is, and I want you to try to guess who it is after I tell you. And he says, the quote is, once you get what you want, you don't want it. And everybody was throwing out, I think that's St. Teresa of Avila. I think it's Teresa of Lisieux. I think it's, this and that, Mother Teresa, or, everybody's throwing out all these things. And he says, no, that was spoken in 51 by the blessed and ever holy Marilyn Monroe. And everybody was like, oh, okay. But I never forgot that quote, it just stuck. And then when I was writing that chapter on happiness, it just seemed to come out. And there's a lot of wisdom in that,
Yeah.
Once you get what you want, you don't want it.
But it seems to me that if your happiness isn't contingent upon the things you get, then you do appreciate the things you have. You know, it's not like, because you weren't like hanging your hopes on getting a such and such.
No.
And like if I got a new bicycle, for instance, it's not like I look forward to that with great anticipation and it's going to be so wonderful. It's like, if I get a new bicycle, great, I love this, and I'll use it for years, and it's so you don't kind of have that addictive
right
chasing.
You're not looking for ultimate happiness in that object. You realize what it is, you realize the limitations of it, and you enjoy it while it's there. It's
Yeah.
like flowers, you know. We bring flowers to people. Women, you know, love to get flowers. My mom used to love to get flowers every birthday, any excuse to get her flowers, and she would get into that. And yet, you know, you don't expect a flower to hang around for 20 years, do you?
Right.
You know the limitations. You know, like, okay, this is beautiful, how beautiful. You can just revel in the beauty of a flower, but you know in a couple days it's not going to be there, and then you throw it away. And that's fine. And I think everything is like that. Like everything in our life, we enjoy it while it's there. We don't deny, you know, that's the whole monastic thing in a way, like denying the world, denying yourself, denying. And, you know, it's kind of like been there, done that. I got the T-shirt. I did it, you know. And there's something to be said for, I'm not knocking renunciation and all that, but it's very easy to get very attached to your renunciation. It's very easy to get some image of yourself as the one who has denied himself, you know, the holy saint who has given up everything and for
Oh, yeah.
God. And it's like, well, then you're right back where you start again. The ego's snuck in through the back door, and now you got a holy ego, which is much harder to get rid of than a worldly ego, you know? And the whole point is that the ego, the self, the concept of me, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist as a holy one. It doesn't exist as a worldly one. It doesn't exist as a rich one. It doesn't exist as a miserable failure. It doesn't exist as a great success. It's not there.
But there must be some remnant of it, isn't there? I mean, if someone says, "Hey, Francis," you turn your head. You know.
Oh, yeah.
You know who he's talking to. So there's some sense of, isn't there some sense of personal self?
Totally.
Yeah.
But I understand now what it is and what it isn't.
Okay.
It's
Elaborate
temporary.
on that.
It's temporary. It's a role I play. It's like that analogy I gave of Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. You know, I was in a lot of plays, like in high school and college, and I was very involved in that kind of stuff. And a lot of times you play a role, and if you're a good actor, you really get into it. You feel the role. You know, you become that while you're on stage in a certain sense. And I think the things we do in life, or our identity, our relative identity in life, we are that on a relative level, but that's not who we are on an absolute level. You know, when I play Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof, when I go home at night, or even when I'm on stage, I'm not going to be conflicted about my daughter marrying a Gentile.
Right.
Because I'm sane, right? I know, you know, I'm not really Tevye. I mean, I am Tevye in one way, but in another way, I'm not Tevye at all. And so you just play with that, like enjoy it. Okay, I'm Tevye, fun, you know. I get to sing, "If I Were a Rich Man," you know, whatever. I get to do all this stuff, but I don't have to let it bother me.
Right.
The story of Tevye is the story of Tevye. That's the way my life is now too. The story of Francis is the story of Francis, and it's interesting, and I still have emotions that arise about it and feelings, and when you call my name, I turn my head, like you say. But on another level, I never lose sight of the fact that that's not who I am.
Yeah.
You know, that's not who you are. That's not who anybody is. So,
All the world's a stage.
yeah. That's Shakespeare.
That's Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I think it's, I don't know, King Lear or something. All the world's a stage, and each man in his time plays many parts.
Yeah.
He has his entrances,
Yeah.
and his exits, and so on.
That's why this sort of like neo-Advaita, non-dual fundamentalism stuff kind of gets me a little bit, because it's kind of like if you were in a play and you got on stage and you were playing the part of Tevye, for example, and you get up on the stage and you look at the audience. You know how Tevye does that? The wall thing, he breaks down that and he talks to the audience in Fiddler on the Roof.
Well, it's been a long time since I only saw the movie, and that was like 40 years ago. But
it's a little technique that they use in theater a lot, where the character suddenly breaks the sort of illusion of the play going on, and he starts addressing the audience. And Tevye would do this, you know, well, should I let her do this or shouldn't I? And maybe, you know, and he kind of like goes back and forth.
On the other hand.
Yeah, on the other hand, maybe she's right, and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's like these totally like, you know, there's no one home, there's no doer, it's like, okay, I get that. I really do get it. I get that there's no doer. I get that there's no one here. But on another level, there is someone here. There is a doer. There is, you know, it's like if you were playing the role of Tevye and you got up on stage and you suddenly gave this big speech to the audience. You know what? I want you all to realize I'm not really Tevye. And these women are not really my daughters. In fact, that's my girlfriend over there. And of course she couldn't be my girlfriend, my daughter at the same time. And and he got up. Well, the director would be so pissed off at you. You'd be ruining the play, And I kind of think sometimes when people get so stuck in this absolute view, like that's all there is. It's like, yeah, in a way that is all there is, but there is this relative world we live in, and most people live only in that world. Like most people don't even have any clue about this absolute level. And if we go around insisting that they don't use personal pronouns and stuff like that, to me, it just seems funny, sort of. And it's like, I don't think it really points to this absolute reality. I think it just makes people think you're weird, if you insist on all this non-dual language. And because language, let's face it, language doesn't get it anyway. Language can only point poorly. It doesn't somehow capture this reality that we're talking about today. So who cares what
Yeah.
Just use normal language. And
I think it's a kind of a sort of an immature level of teaching that many of them have actually evolved out of. There are a number of people who
Oh, really?
There's a number of some of whom I've actually spoken to, like Krishna Gauchi and some others who sort of tease themselves about how the way they used to be when they first came back from Lucknow, and how they use this convoluted way of not identifying that there's any individuality.
I totally get that, because I went through these 4 or 5 months of just not even hardly being able to speak. And so I understand the sense that this language just doesn't accurately point at all. And I understand that sense of things.
And you try to speak in alignment with that, but
you try, but you can't really.
Right.
How could you? You just can't. So language is limited, but it's what we have to communicate, at least so far. So
yeah,
might as well use it,
Yeah, but your point is well taken, and as you know, it's been a kind of a theme in these interviews, and you sent me a long email about it that we could talk about at this point. Well, one point we've already sort of touched upon, that comes up, and since there's ultimately no person present, who is left to do spiritual practices? And you mentioned that to you, it's like saying, since there's no person present, who's left to eat food,
Right.
or breathe, or whatever. And I guess maybe we could summarize it as kind of the confusion of levels fallacy.
Yeah.
Where you on some level, fine, there's no person.
Right.
Got it. But that doesn't obviate or levels on which there is a practical utility to doing this, that, or the other thing.
In fact, the realization of that drastically changes the way you move through the relative world. If you realize the absolute view, then the relative is then relative, right? Mm-hmm. It's not absolute anymore. So when bad things happen to you, for example, or death or of a loved one, or all these things, these are things that happen to people. And believe me, I deal with this in my profession. I had to comfort people who had lost loved ones. I had to, be there for people and be present to people and try to bring some comfort and some peace to them. And so I'm not minimizing those things. Those are things that impact people. But when you have this absolute view, then you see it for what it is. That doesn't mean that the normal human emotions don't arise. You can still grieve. You can still feel a sense of loss. All that stuff is, in fact, it's in some ways it's even more acute because you're more open. This opens you up so that nothing is threatening anymore, because you are the spacious awareness in which everything arises and ceases. So whatever arises is welcome. It's not, it's like, okay, that's arising. Well, that's interesting,
And I'm sure you're not saying to these people whom you're counseling, oh, nobody dies, and
no,
there's no need for grief because yada yada.
No.
Not giving a lot of spiritual platitudes.
Because they're at that moment, they're dealing with emotions that are arising in the absolute spaciousness, but they're dealing with something that is relative. So I have to be on their level to deal with them dealing with it, like a dream thing. Like you say, if you're in a dream and a tiger's chasing you, you need a dream gun to shoot the tiger.
Right.
A real gun won't deal with a dream tiger.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work that way. Or a dream gun won't deal with a real tiger in your everyday life.
Yeah.
you know? So if I'm on a level with somebody and they're really in the relative world and they're dealing with something there, then I have to come down to that and, well, not come down, that's not the right, but you know what I mean. I have to deal with them on that level.
Yeah.
And,
Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Just deal according to the level at which you,
right.
yeah, at which the situation
I,
exists.
I love this sort of concept that Ken Wilber talks about. He talks about these different phases of development in consciousness and so on, but each phase includes the lower phase. Like it doesn't negate the lower phase, it just transcends it.
Yeah.
So like when you get the absolute view, you transcend the relative, but the relative's still there.
Yeah,
And you can, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's say you had like a 20-story building, and you keep going up a floor and looking out the window. Each time you go up another floor, you have a wider vista, but that vista doesn't negate the lesser vista that you had from lower floors. It just includes it and extends it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the same, you know, idea. And it's just there's no problem with the relative. It's the relative. It's fine. It's just not absolute. That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you could make a concluding point on this whole thing in a nutshell, what would it be? This point we've just been covering. Or if you want, I'll make one.
I think I would just point to that Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. I think that says it all. It's not, there's no problem with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Then, let's see. There was more to your email here. Point 2. There's also seems to be, this is a good one. There also seems to be the idea that the eternally present presence of awareness or consciousness means that we are all already awakened. Or many would probably prefer to say impersonal awakeness is simply present. So there's no need to do or become anything whatsoever. And you say, well, I would concur on an absolute level. These are both true enough statements. The practical relative application that is being made with these statements is not a very skillful means of applying these truths.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that, well, and I think if you look at what is spiritual practice really, like if you boil it down, and the really good spiritual practices that seem to really work in people's lives, what they are, it's just a kind of resting in that awareness that's already present. It's a pointing to the ability to shift one's attention to rest in that awareness. It's never not present. It's always here and now. And all you need to do is realize it's like the fish looking for the ocean. You know, all he needs to do is relax and realize that the ocean's all around him and in him, and he is the ocean.
Yeah,
and
but that can be easier said than done.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know about the fish, but most people in the world are very caught up in the play.
Yeah.
You know, and
that's why things like instructions about if a thought arises, let it go and just come back to your simple sense of awareness. That's a kind of meditational instruction. And some people could say, well, there's a doer there, and you know, who's doing that, and so on. But it's like, well, all it's doing is it's pointing to the ability that we all naturally, innately have to rest in beingness. Just to rest there. And there's no doing in being. Being is just being.
Yeah.
And spiritual practice are just a way to point people to that ability that is innate within them to simply rest in their beingness. And I don't see any problem. There doesn't have to be a doer necessarily. A lot of times, yes, in the early phases of meditation and so on, there is definitely a sense of, I'm going to do this. I'm going to conquer this technique. I'm going to be the best meditator, that ever was. And and I went through that. I mean, we all go through that.
But
and
if you're doing that, chances are you're going to be straining.
Yeah, you're going to be straining.
And that strain isn't going to really be very fruitful in terms of...
Maybe a fruitfulness of it is that you wear it out.
Yeah.
You wear out the straining and you realize, well, that's not it. I strained and strained and strained, and all I did was create a headache.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you realize, well, that must not be it. So then you lighten up a little bit and you don't strain as much and you just kind of rest in the awareness. And then maybe, I don't think anything's really lost in the journey. Everything we do, even the mistakes we make, we learn something from it, it somehow points us ultimately in the right direction in one way or another.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, the
you know,
Gita says no effort is lost and no obstacle exists.
right, right. That says it really well.
Yeah. It's funny 'cause when I was interviewing Andrew Cohen a few weeks ago, he was talking about when he had been spending some time with Papaji, and he had kind of settled into this very profound, easy, you know, natural state. And then he went home that evening and tried to meditate, so to speak, and
Mm.
he immediately got a splitting headache. And you
You
know,
couldn't do it anymore,
my
probably the
sense
way it
when I
was.
heard him say that, yeah, was that he had been in the habit of an effortful kind of practice, and
Right,
which stuck out like a sore thumb in that easy, natural state that the presence of Papaji had evoked in him.
right, right. That's good. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's true.
There's a verse in the Vedas someplace, I don't know where from, that says, "Be easy to us with gentle effort."
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
You know so many beautiful quotes.
Oh, you know, I've got a limited little picnic basket full.
Uh, seems like a lot to me.
Yeah. I'm not like somebody like Ken Wilber or something who's a walking encyclopedia.
Yeah.
In fact, if you listen to enough of these interviews, you hear me using the same things over and over again.
I've listened to a number of them now. I've listened to probably, I would say 20.
Cool.
Hmm.
Now, it's interesting with regard to this whole topic of practice. You know, let's say a person is in a really agitated, you know, miserable state, very confused and conflicted and unhappy and so on, and they begin a spiritual practice. Obviously, when they sit down to do it, they aren't going to sink into the kind of state that, you know, you experience for several hours each morning. There's going to be a lot of turmoil going on.
Right.
Would you, as a teacher, have any kind of advice for them on how to, you know, deal with that?
Well, of course, you know, you have to deal with each person in reality that's right in front of you with an actual face on and so on. But so there's no, like, I don't think a pat answer, but my kind of general sense of what I would do in a situation like that would be to give them like a mantra or something, to give them some kind of calming technique and just say, you know, just sit quietly and just in a chair, if you know, however you're comfortable, and just use this word. And when your mind starts to wander into all the turmoil and all your problems and so on, kind of let go of that for now, and just, you can go back to that later. It'll still be there after your meditation, you know, after 20 minutes or so. But in the meantime, just rest in that word. Just breathe it in, breathe it out. Do, you know, because it's like, it's like the idea of when you take a course in Spanish, say, and you got Spanish 1, Spanish 2, Spanish 3, you know, you need to take Spanish 1 before you can take Spanish 2. And you need to take Spanish 2 before you can take Spanish 3. That's the best way to learn Spanish. And with this, like, I think that the essence of really spiritual practice that really goes deep is this idea of what's often called self-inquiry, or I would call it self-abiding or self-investigation. And it's just this resting in the awareness, in the spacious awareness that's already present all the time.
Hmm.
But in order to do that, it's better if the mind is a bit calm. It's not so agitated. You know, when the mind is agitated, you can't just automatically go to rest in that awareness that's already present, because the mind is it's covering it over. You know, it's like obscured by all the activity in the mind and in the head. So I would say get that quieted down a little. And it's like TM, they've done all kinds of scientific research about how this affects blood pressure and heart rate, and it calms you and all this stuff, you know, that proves that physiologically even there's an effect from all this. And I would say the best route for a person like that would be to get into some kind of calming practice like that, and then eventually introduce the idea of resting and awareness. But first do this as a preliminary kind of a level 1 thing. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the way I would approach that.
Yeah, and, you know, and not to be discouraged, not to sort of feel like you're failing because your experience doesn't seem to match that of such and such a teacher that you've listened to, who
Right.
just seems so serene and settled and clear. You know, not to feel like you're doing something wrong, but to just realize that, you know, what is it they say, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, and just,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And you know, another thing I might suggest to a person like that, and I have actually suggested this to people like that, is that one day it just came to me. I was talking to this woman, and she was very much in turmoil, and she said she was a failure. She kept saying, "I'm just a big failure. I'm just the biggest failure. I'm a spiritual failure. I've been at this stuff for years and years, and nothing's happened, and I'm just this big failure." And I said, "Yeah, but there's somebody in you." Like she also said, "I'm never aware. I can't be aware, you know." And I said, "Okay, but there's something in you. There's somebody there that's aware of the fact that you're not aware. There's something in you that's aware of the idea that you are a failure. So that's there, right? I mean, that has to be there. So kind of try to just turn your attention to that. Just sort of shift your attention and be aware of that which is aware that you're not aware."
Right.
And she got it. She was like, "Oh yeah, I see what you mean. It has to be there, doesn't it?" I said, "Yeah." So in that sense, even the most unspiritual stuff we experience that are arising, all of it points back to that spacious, absolutely open awareness, doesn't it? It can't help but do that because that's what it's arising out of.
Yeah.
The turmoil in my thinking and all that, what's that arising in? It has no choice. It has to arise in the spacious awareness, right? So even that points. In that sense, everything that we experience, every experience in life points to this awareness which is beyond experience, which is the ground of all experience, you could say. It can't help but point to it.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd say that, the takeaway point from the discussion we've been having for the last 20 minutes or so is, just because we understand ultimately that there is no person, that doesn't mean that spiritual practices are irrelevant or unnecessary. There may come a time when they are.
Sure.
But
sure, there is a time when they are, I
but
think.
don't jump the gun,
No. It's like that old analogy that the Buddha used about crossing the river with a boat. You cross the river with the boat, but when you're in the middle of the river, you don't discard the boat.
Right.
You keep the boat till you cross the river.
Yeah.
And then you leave the boat and you go and walk, to where you're going on land. You don't need the boat anymore. It'd be kind of a burden then to be holding onto the boat.
Yes.
But when you're in the middle of the river, I would not advise discarding your boat at that point in your journey.
Right.
That's the point where the boat is kind of useful. And I think it's the same thing in the spiritual journey. There's a time and a place for everything, as it says in Ecclesiastes. And I think where people, I don't know what it is, why people, I don't know. It's hard to say why you hear that so much. I mean, on one level, I can see where they're saying, well, it's already all here, so therefore you don't need to do anything. It's like, yeah, on one level, that's true. But on the other hand, as Tevye would say, so.
Well, personally, I think that the reason they hear it so much is that a lot of people who present themselves as teachers are primarily just, they have an intellectual familiarity, possibly, and in many cases, probably supplemented with some genuine experience, but it just hasn't ripened to the point where it's completely comprehensive and capable of incorporating all levels of experience, such as to meet any person on their own level and teach accordingly.
Well, gee, I hope that's not true, because because you can only take somebody as far as you've come. You can't even point to anything further than what you've already seen.
Right.
So if you haven't seen much and you just have an intellectual conceptual kind of notion of these things, then you could maybe help somebody get a good conceptual notion, but that's not going to be, well, it doesn't hurt, but I don't think it's going to be that helpful ultimately.
Well, I guess the proof of the pudding would be, how common are genuine and abiding realizations in the people who listen to these teachers. And I haven't done any kind of scientific survey by any means, but that would be an interesting question to ask.
I was just talking. I actually hooked up on the Skype with Trip Overholt. I saw him on your show, and then he had actually referred somebody to me, and I kind of just got in contact with him and said, thank you for referring this person to me, and they, I think maybe I can be of some benefit to them. And anyway, we ended up Skyping and talking. And he said he was at this, I won't say what it was, but it was like a big conference of this kind of thing with teachers and things present. And this pretty well-known teacher was in the front giving a talk. And Tripp, and you know Tripp, I don't know, he seems pretty spontaneous. And he just got up and he said, I turned to the room and I said, how many people here have had a personal direct scene of this spacious awareness that this guy is talking about? Mm-hmm. And he said there were like 120 people in the room, and he said maybe like 4 people raised their hands.
Yeah.
And I was kind of shocked by that. I was like, wow, okay, well, I kind of thought that, see, in my milieu, it's like there's not a lot of people that I ran across that had even a glimpse of all this stuff. And a few people I was working with sort of began to get glimpses, but I just didn't run across it. But like when I first heard about all this whole non-dual kind of scene with all these teachers and stuff, and I thought, well, I'll bet a lot of these people are waking up, a lot of these, and I think a lot of them are, but maybe not as many as sometimes we think. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting anecdote. It kind of points to what I was saying.
Yeah.
Which means that, which kind of, leads to the point that words don't suffice. It's not sufficient to listen to somebody talk about it or to read books about it or something. Something has to be done to make it a living experiential reality.
Right. And I think little simple practices that point to this awareness that you already are, yes, but they point you to it so that you can have a direct realization of it yourself. Yeah. I think it's useful. I think practices I'm all for spiritual practice. I think it really is. And I think all the really great teachers like Ramana and people like that, they certainly encouraged people to do practices. Mm-hmm. And if it's good enough for Ramana, it's good enough for me, I would say. You know.
Well, it's interesting. Some people might say, well, hey, in your case, you've already had this realization. It's permanent. Nothing seems to perturb it. Why do you bother sitting for 2-3 hours in the morning?
I don't know. It's just fun.
Uh-huh.
I love to just be in that silence and fully just in that alone. There's something just sort of spontaneously, I find myself doing that. It's not like a practice. Mm-hmm. It's not a program.
You're just drawn to it.
Yeah. And in fact, when I'm just going through my life, if I'm not engaged in something where I have to be doing some thought about it, or there has to be some sort of a conceptual thing going on with it, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm resting in that.
Just settled in that, yeah.
Yeah, and just enjoying it, and mm-hmm. Why not?
I would suspect that not only is it intrinsically enjoyable or fulfilling, but there must be some effect it's having over time, culturing something or other.
I would suspect so too.
Yeah.
I often thought when I was a Trappist, because you're off in the country, secluded in this place, and you're not doing any kind of work in the world. You're just praying and doing contemplative stuff and being a monk. And I often wondered about that. There was a guy in the refectory when I was a novice, and he actually had a very bad sort of mental breakdown early on, I think in the 50s, and was schizophrenic, paranoid schizophrenic, and he was a monk. And he was in the infirmary, and I used to clean his room all the time. And he never spoke, and he just sat in his room. But at night, you'd go by his room, and you'd hear him chanting these prayers and things. And I used to, I used to think about that, and I'd go past this brother's room, and I'd hear him doing this little Latin chanting in there and stuff. And it would often occur to me, and I just wonder, I wonder what that's doing in the world. Maybe he's the one keeping the whole thing going. Yeah. Maybe he's the most important person in the whole face of the planet. And our human sort of appraisal of that is, he's useless. He's kind of living this useless life. He's this paranoid schizophrenic stuck away in a Trappist monastery somewhere. And what good is he doing? And yet, maybe we don't. I'm pretty sure we don't see the whole picture at all.
Right.
Maybe some yogi somewhere in the Himalayas is sitting in a cave staring at the wall, and he's the one keeping the whole thing running, Who knows?
Well, a lot of people have said that, Yogananda and others, that they're, a lot of people squirreled away that you never see, but they're actually having a huge impact on the world.
I suspect that's true. Mm-hmm. I really do.
Yeah. have a couple times during this interview you've become kind of emotional, which is great. Have you found since your awakening, perhaps, that there's a kind of a deeper and deeper devotional quality developing?
You know, for many years, since I was probably 13, 14 years old, I had a very deep devotional quality to my spiritual life. And I loved Jesus. I loved, I just had this really strong sense of devotion to Jesus. And sorry about the table keeps shaking. There's now a dog under it, so he's shaking.
Well, they're doing a lot of fracking in Ohio, and it's causing earthquakes, I've heard.
I don't know. That's when you take off the top of the mountain and.
No, that's when it's a whole thing where they're getting
anyway.
natural gas from deep in the ground, but they're sort of really messing up a lot of. There's a whole movie about it called Gasland, which you can see if you want to know about it.
Oh yeah, I'll have to watch it. But now what was I saying?
We were talking about devotion, and you were very devotional
I really had
as a young man.
strong devotional sense, and I have all my life really. And then when this discovery of this spacious awareness sort of hit me, for 4 or 5 months, I was immersed in love. I was immersed in absolute love. So in that sense, I was in devotion, but it didn't have any kind of personal characteristic to it. And then the interesting thing now is that I've come back to the point where I have a very personal devotion. And again, because of this integration of the relative and the absolute, I see absolutely no issue with that. It's like, yeah, it's just the absolute playing the game of duality. It's like if you love your wife, well, in one sense, there is no wife. Her name is just a word. It does, you can say all that. And yet there's this wonderful dance that goes on between lovers, isn't there? That they love each other, they enjoy each other, they celebrate that. And there's something about that that's really very valid. And I think it's the same in the spiritual. You look at somebody like Ramana. He had all this devotion to Arunachala. He circumambulated this mountain. He talked about it as his father. He used all this imagery of, that it was Shiva and all this stuff, And I think in all these really, really highly realized people, in yanis, these people that really get it, they're totally got it. And there's a sense that, like this relative absolute thing, there's no problem whatsoever between having this absolute view and really abiding and resting in that and being very devotional and being a bhakta person, It's like, I don't see, there's no problem with it.
All the great teachers of Advaita were that way. I mean, Shankara was very devotional, wrote all kinds of beautiful devotional hymns and all. He was known to have said, the intellect imagines duality for the sake of devotion.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you mentioned Ramana. And then Nisargadatta, he would do pujas every night, and,
right.
Gayatri mantra and all kinds of devotional practices.
So the answer to that is yes, I'm very devotional.
Yeah.
In my own way. I mean, I don't feel somehow compelled to share with everybody what my devotions are and to get them to accept my devotions. And, my devotions are my devotions on that relative level. This body here, this mind here, has certain devotions that appeal to me, and I do them, but you have to find your own way in that,
I was just curious as to whether your awakening or your realization had somehow fueled a more profound quality of devotion than had been possible
I would say
before
so.
you really knew who you were.
Yeah,
I mean, to put it in these terms, like if you don't know who you are, who is it that's going to be devoted to whatever, But it seems like self-realization could actually be the foundation for a much richer type of devotion or something.
Well, it is, because ultimately your devotion is directed toward the self that you are.
Right.
So how wonderful that is. I mean, for all these years, I was like seeking God, seeking intimacy with God. And then I realized that it's all right here. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens to me when I get a little emotional. It's like the realization of that just becomes fully there, and it's overwhelming. I mean, the only way you can describe it is that you're just adrift in this big sea of bliss and love. And you realize that it's so intimate that it's who you actually are. And there's something so intimate and so beautiful about that, you know.
Did you ever
Don't,
read the Upanishads at all?
I have a little bit. I
Yeah.
have, you know, some Vedic stuff. I read the Bhagavad Gita.
hmm
I've read some things in that tradition, yeah. And I
There's a
love it.
there's a whole section in the how do you pronounce it? Brihadaranyaka Upanishad where it goes through a whole lot of things that people typically love. And it says, you know, it is not for the sake of the self that it's not for the sake of the wife that the wife is dear, but for the sake of the self that the wife is dear. It is not for the sake of the son that the son is dear, but for the sake of the self that the son is dear. And it kind of
Wow.
ticks off a whole checklist like that.
That's beautiful.
Drills
You
home the
know, what kind of great marriage counseling thing could that be? Your
Yeah.
devotion to your spouse is your devotion to the supreme self.
hmm
You know, that's like Mother Teresa's thing that she saw Christ in everyone.
Mm.
You know, she was saying, you know, that Jesus, that she had all this sense of devotion to and kind of a bhakti devotion to, was in the poor and the suffering
hmm
that she ministered
Yeah, she
to.
would actually see Jesus as she was like washing Jesus's feet, curing Jesus's
Right.
wounds or whatever. Yeah,
Right. That's my
beautiful.
sense too. When I deal with people suffering, I see in them the suffering Christ, or I see the divine in them. You know, sometimes it just absolutely melts. My heart melts
Mm,
to people. It just,
that's sweet.
yeah, it's very, it's such an honor to be able to engage people on that level, at the level of their pain and suffering, to be present, to just be presence for them.
Mm,
You don't even have to say anything, you know. It's just being presence. And and that creates a space. Sometimes I've even seen that visibly, people changing like on their deathbeds. And you're very aware that you're the spacious presence that this death is arising in. And you see this sort of peace come, just descend on the room, and it just, you know, it's beautiful. And
mm.
it's really, it's drastically changed my ministry, what I've been involved in ministry. Um, it's on a completely different level than it was.
That's neat. I bet you people really get a different kind of effect from you than they used to.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, people say that.
yeah.
My own community, when this happened, even though I didn't really talk about it in my community, and several of the brothers came to me and said, "What's going on with you? Like what, you know, you're like, you're just," one brother said, "You're shining like the sun."
Whoa,
And I was like, and then I just shined more. It was like, yeah.
nice.
I had one guy, he walked up to me, and I was waiting in a doctor's office. And this guy walked up to me and he goes, "What's with you?" And I was like, "What?" And he said, "What's going on with you? Like, you just seem so happy."
Aha.
And I said, I didn't know what to say. It was at that point where I couldn't really speak. And I just said, "I don't know. I am happy." I didn't know what to tell him.
Very sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of gives you an inkling of what the society might be like if this sort of thing were the norm rather than the exception.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, isn't that maybe is part of that whole evolutionary enlightenment thing that Andrew Cohen was talking about?
hmm
That I mean, I don't know a lot about that, and a lot of that seems a little over my head, sort of. I'm not the most bright person, I don't think, but it seems a little complicated, sort of on an intellectual level. But my sense of what I did get of what he was saying was that that's kind of what he's pointing to, that enlightenment is not, and it clearly isn't, a personal thing. There are no enlightened people. I mean, strictly speaking, we use that term to be able to talk about this, but you know, I mean, on an absolute level, there's no enlightened person or unenlightened person.
right.
In the book, I use this example. It just came to me. Was it's like talking about curly-haired unicorns and straight-haired unicorns.
hmm
You know, enlightened and unenlightened people.
Right.
You know, it's like, well,
Yeah, but you're speaking from the absolute view.
right,
On a
exactly.
relative view, there are.
Absolutely,
You
and
know.
I'm not negating it at all. I'm not
Yeah.
one of these absolutist fundamentalist
Yeah.
people. I think that's clear. I would hope.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, but
Cause yeah. All right.
yeah, but both. I mean, when some of these people make these absolute statements, I can totally get where they're coming from. I mean, I totally understand very deeply that, yeah, on an absolute level, ultimately what you're saying is absolutely correct. But I think that we have to just recognize that we've got to move through this relative world. That seems to be the way it's set up, isn't it?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not like they're incorrect, as you say, but there's no practical utility to it.
Yeah, it's like it doesn't, yeah, there's nothing you can really apply it to.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Huh. Did you ever see the movie Zeitgeist?
No.
That'll kind of rock your world a little bit. I just watched it last week. It's very interesting. The first part of the movie, they go into how there are at least a dozen traditions that they mention, which had basically the story of Jesus, but it wasn't Jesus. Like, born of a virgin,
Yeah.
went through this, that, and the other thing. Got crucified, had 12 disciples,
Yeah.
got crucified, rose from the dead after 3 days, and the whole movie kind of calls into question whether there actually was a historical Jesus or whether it's just a rehashing of an ancient archetype that
Hmm.
has been going around the world in many cultures. So
Yeah.
the reason I
Well,
mention it is just because I just saw that movie and I was wondering what a religious person such as yourself would say to such a thing.
well, I mean, if you'd asked me that probably 12 years ago or something, I might have said something different than I would today. But today I would say that, yeah, I mean, my insight about Jesus now is that all the things that the Christian religion has sort of said about Jesus, if you look at just a simple creed, for example, it says, I believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father. This is a beautiful, beautiful phrase. The next, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, one in being with the Father. Through him, all things were made. And what I saw after this happened was that's true of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
All those things we say about Jesus are who we really are.
Mm.
How beautiful is that?
Yeah.
God from God, light from light. It's beautiful.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, we could do a whole interview just about religious stuff,
Probably, because my sense of the gospel and what religious things are has radically shifted, I'd have to say.
Yeah. In fact, that would be an interesting thing for you to do, is to write some books giving a sort of your take on traditional religious teachings and putting them in the light of Vedanta or non-dual. Swami Vivekananda, I believe, and also Yogananda tried to do that. They took certain scriptures
Yeah.
and tried to comment on them in the light.
I've read some of that stuff they wrote. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. In case you don't get a job that keep you busy.
Yeah, better get a job pretty soon. The money's going.
Yeah, right. What money? There's no money.
No. But on a relative level,
There's
on
money.
the other hand,
Right.
you need a job.
Yeah.
So
Great.
I'm not worried about it. It'll all work out. It'll all come out in the wash, as they say.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's interesting on this point that there's this one guy in particular, I know many stories like this, where people have devoted their life to spiritual practice and spiritual stuff, and then they start getting old, their health starts breaking down, they realize they have no money. Ram Dass was a case in point. I mean, he kept giving everything away, and then they think, oh, what am I going to do? They're kind of in trouble. So it's kind of good to keep it all in balance.
Yeah, I think you need to keep it all in balance, and you need to be just have common sense. I mean,
Yeah.
like I say, the absolute does not negate that relative level. Like Ken Wilber has these stages. All the stages exist. Even when you go to the next stage, the lower stages don't cease to exist. They're still there. You just move through them differently. You see them differently,
All right. Well, moving toward a conclusion, do you have well, we can keep going, but
I don't care.
in fact, if there's things that are kind of in the back of your mind that we haven't discussed, feel free to bring them up. But one thing I was going to ask is, do you have any sense of where this might be going for you? I mean, based upon the trajectory that you have seen in your life in the last 3-4 years, is there kind of any inkling of, where you might be like 3, 4, or 30 or 40 years from now, other than dead? If I go if I go out that far.
I'm 53 now, so.
Yeah, you could last another 40, no sweat.
Yeah, maybe. I'm pretty healthy.
Yeah.
But I really am already functioning, I think, as a spiritual teacher, I guess.
Hmm.
I don't have an identity as a spiritual teacher. I mean, that's not who I am at all, of course. But, there seems to be that role there, and I seem to have something to say.
Hmm.
I mean, at least people tell me that. Like, I was giving a lot of spiritual direction as a monk, and a lot of people seem to be profoundly affected by that and helped. And I love that. That's what I've given my whole life to, and I love sharing this with people. I have a passion for this,
Hmm.
and I think to do what your passion is makes sense to me. Um, I don't have a lot of concerns about the money part, but I'd like to be able to put bread on my table and, you know,
Yeah.
do all that. So, but what I'll be doing in 3 years, I mean, oof, who knows?
Hmm.
I, I'm open to how it unfolds, and I'm kind of just as curious as you are or anybody else, I suppose. But I don't really have a clear sense of how it's going to all unfold.
Right.
I trust sort of that the people I need to meet, I'll meet. The people that need to hear me will hear me, and they'll do what they do, and I'll do what I do, and it'll all just kind of flow together somehow. That maybe sounds very hippie-like or something, but
Yeah, kind of. Well, there are a number of teachers these days who are pretty active, well-known teachers who didn't really have, well, Eckhart Tolle is a case in point, who didn't really have some kind of motivational scheme in mind. I mean, organizational scheme in mind that they were going to do what they ended up doing. But one thing led to the next. He was sitting on
that,
a park bench,
yeah,
feeding the pigeons, trying to
yeah,
get himself a little bit integrated.
yeah,
Someone would sit down next to him. They'd start talking. Next thing you knew, he was having little sessions with people.
right.
Long story short, he's on the Oprah show. So,
I'm not planning on being on Oprah anytime soon.
right.
I think that that's sort of the way that kind of stuff happens if it's authentic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking is actually there might be somebody who's watching this, for instance, who might have a little satsang thing or something in their vicinity where they have people come in and teach, and they might like to send you a plane ticket and have you come out and cover your expenses and have you give a talk, and that might parlay into something else. So yeah, if anybody's listening, and I suspect you'd be amenable to that. Um,
Sure.
get,
Why not?
yeah, get in touch with friends. I think you would be a very entertaining, and I don't mean that in a trivial sense. Very kind of interesting guy to sit and listen to, give a talk or a retreat or something.
Well, I actually, in fact, I have done a lot of that in my life. I mean, I've
Yeah.
given retreats, I've given talks, I've preached, I've done counseling with people. All the things that spiritual teachers do, I've spent half my life doing already.
But now there's
So
a new dimension to it.
there's a new dimension to it. And I don't know where well, I don't know if I should say this on this public forum, but I don't really know where my relationship to the church and all that is going to go. At the moment, I don't know. It's a
Yeah.
mystery to me. I certainly, my theology has certainly shifted
Hmm.
quite a bit. So we'll see what happens with that.
Good.
Some people are concerned about that. I have very close friends that are wonderful, beautiful people who love me, and they're very, very in the church, and they're, concerned about me. I'm a little heretical, I suppose, in some ways, but
Yeah. Personally, I think that independence of thought and kind of an independent spirit is a characteristic of evolving spirituality. It's like at a certain point the chick no longer is quite at home in the incubator. It needs to kind of step out and start pecking around in the barnyard a bit.
well, I'm sure that the universe or God or consciousness or whatever label you want to put on all this, it has some plan because I was definitely guided to leave the monastic life. I mean, it was just very clear to me that this is not the form for this person to be in anymore.
Right.
And I don't know why. I didn't have a plan. It wasn't like I don't want to do this, I want to do that. It wasn't like that. It was just clear that I needed to put myself in another situation, and I'm trusting that it will unfold, as things go on and develop, and
Yeah.
we'll see what happens.
Good.
Yeah.
It works that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's I don't make decisions. I know when I was thinking about leaving, and I was encouraged to go on a retreat, and I went on this retreat, and the person I was working with was what we call an Ignatian director. So they do this whole form that was developed by St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, and it's a whole kind of a complicated sort of process of discernment, and you reflect on Scripture, and you go through this kind of conceptual thinking about, the good points of this decision, like making the decision in your imagination and then living with the results of that and all this kind of stuff. And I just like looked at this director and I was like, this ain't going to happen. I mean, I said, I just don't make decisions anymore. Life lives me, and I let it live me, and I know what to do when I need to, but I don't know beforehand. And I just, to do this would just be laughable. I can't even imagine doing a process like that. So he said, well, just be quiet this week and we'll see what arises. And what arose was that, yeah, you need to leave. It's time for you to leave. And
Yeah.
so I just went in and told him. He said, well, you seem at peace about it. I said, I'm totally at peace about it. And he said, well, what can I say?
That's great.
Yeah.
Good. Well, let's conclude. So Maharishi once said, you always feel like talking to an old monk. And,
Is that what I am, an old monk?
no, I dropped the adjective old, but
Middle-aged monk.
yeah.
Well,
But
if we're concluding, I want to say something to you.
Sure.
I really, really appreciate your kindness in having me on here.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's an opportunity for me to share, and that's what I love. I love to share this with people, and it's my passion in life, and I just have so much compassion for people. And what we've been talking about is the key to happiness and love and all the things that people want in their life. And I hope somehow or other, my life can be a vehicle for that for people. So thank you.
Well, it is being, and I'm sure it will continue to be more and more. Yeah. So it's not a big kindness. It's just I knew you would be a good guest, and and I really kind of jumped at the opportunity to have this conversation with you. So
Yeah, I don't even know how it started exactly. I think
you emailed me and
you
told
that
me
I
a little-
liked your show.
Yeah.
I had no idea that you. I thought you only asked like famous teachers to come on your show at first. I didn't know
Well,
I saw.
I try to
well,
keep a
obviously-
balance. It's fun to talk to the famous teachers, but I really want to continue to talk to people that no one's ever heard of. Because, I mean, sometimes the famous ones are really good at talking, and that's one of the reasons why you like to talk to them, because they have their act together in terms of articulating this.
Right.
But that's not necessary. It's not necessarily always that way. And, some of my favorite interviews that I've done are with just regular people that, don't have any kind of public role whatsoever.
Yeah. The other thing I want to say is I want to express my gratefulness to Scott Killaby, because I got in contact with him through your show, and he's been really such a help to me and helping me kind of come to a sense of understanding about all this stuff. And I haven't had really even a lot of contact with him, but it's just been very affirming, and I just think the world of him. I think he's a great teacher and really has helped me.
Yeah. No, Scott's great. Hopefully you'll be able to come out to the Science and Non-Duality Conference in
I hope so.
October. Scott will be there, and I'll be there, and all kinds of people, and
Yeah.
get to meet some of these folks.
Yeah. I hope I'll have money by then.
Yeah. Well, maybe somebody will listen to this and send you enough money to get to the conference.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. And me too. I've got a donate button on the on Batgap.com.
Oh, you're in the same boat I am. Okay.
Yeah. No, people send in donations from time to time. It helps finance things like that.
I'm surprised the Oprah Network or something hasn't like wanted to pick up your show, because it's really fascinating.
Oprah herself does something like this.
Does she?
She sits down and talks to Llewellyn Vaughan Lee and Deepak Chopra and various people, and has these kinds of conversations. And but hey, Oprah Network, if you're listening, I'm available.
Yeah.
Oprah can still do her thing, and we'll have another show.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah. All right, good. So let me make a couple of concluding remarks. I've had one guy who complains, why don't you just let your guests go? Why do you make them sit there while you make concluding remarks? And the reason is that if I let you go, then I've got to disconnect the connection, and it won't be recording anymore. So
Oh, right.
so
I'm fine. I'm fine to sit here.
I'm sure
perfectly
you
happy.
are, yeah. But for the benefit of those who've been listening or watching, you've been listening to an interview on a show that we call Buddha at the Gas Pump, and it's an ongoing series. There's a new one each week. So If you're listening on YouTube, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel and you'll be notified by YouTube when a new one is posted. Or you also may wish to go to batgap.com, where they're all archived and where you will also see a link to an audio podcast. Many people prefer to just listen to this in audio. And you also see a little discussion group there that crops up around each interview, which many times becomes quite lively. I encourage people to try to keep the discussions somewhat relevant to each specific interview, and there's a general discussion tab for those who wish to just sort of talk about anything under the sun, but I'm not going to police it. I don't even have time to read them all, so just have at it, have fun. So that about covers it. Next week I'm going to be speaking to a gentleman named Howard Falco, who had a very spontaneous and profound awakening, and sounds like he's going to be an interesting guy. And the week after that, Anita Moorjani, who's quite well known, who was at death's door with cancer and full of tumors the size of lemons, and had this near-death experience and woke up out of it, and tumors went away, and she had this profound awakening. So that'll be interesting. So in any case, and one more thing is that if you'd like to be notified of all these things by email, there's a button on batgap.com, a tab where you click and you can sign up for a newsletter, and you'll get an email about once a week each time a new one is posted. So thanks for listening or watching, and we'll see you, or you'll hear from us next week.
Bye.
Bye.